Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World, the Practical Voice Podcast. This episode of VUX World is brought to you by Speebly. If you haven't checked out Speebly yet, I strongly encourage you to do so. What it does is, instead of having a chatbot on your website, if you use the Speebly widget, you'll have a chatbot, but it will be a voice-based chatbot. You will be able to have a conversation with your website, or your client will be able to have a conversation with their website. And if you use Dialogflow for your Alexa skills or your Google Assistant actions, then you can point Dialogflow to Speebly, and essentially you'll then be able to interact with your skill or action via the website. It's absolutely fantastic. Also, based on the conversation that you have with the widget and how you configure it, you can actually navigate people through your site based on the conversation. It's absolutely fantastic. You should check it out straight away. Speebly have a deal for VUX World listeners where if you enable Speebly on one of your client's websites and your client then pays Speebly the monthly fee for using the widget, Speebly will actually give you a kickback, which is fantastic because it means that the client gets to enable their website with voice, the user ends up having an engaging, interactive experience on your client's website, and you get paid. It's fantastic. You should totally check it out. Go to speebly.com/VUX. That's SPEEBLY.com/VUX. On this week's episode of VUX World, we're speaking to Nick Carey of Potato. He's based out in San Francisco. Potato have an office in London, and Nick has been involved in some of the headline-grabbing, high-profile Alexa skills from the past year. We can't name names, unfortunately, but you will definitely have seen the headlines for this skill. He comes from a gaming background, a gaming design background, and they use voice at Potato really as a way of augmenting the traditional or console gaming experience. So they've built what the concept is a voice assistant on an assistant. So Alexa is an assistant in its own right, but Nick's approach is to build an assistant on top of that platform, something that can help a user navigate through, let's say, a game and provide value and assistance throughout that game. So rather than you having to go into a menu and go and get your inventory, you can just ask your assistant on the voice platform to go ahead and do that for you. This episode was intended to advance the conversation we had with Gordon Midwood about how voice can augment the gaming experience, but what it turned into actually was just a whole conversation full of bags of insight from Nick. The way that Nick is approaching voice and some of the kind of concepts and methodologies he's using is really, really refreshing, and there's so many things in this that you'll be able to use as a designer, as a strategist, and as a developer to really improve the way that you go about crafting experiences. We have a really, really good conversation about the concept of utility versus affinity and the difference between the two, and how you need to be working on your brand and you need to be working on the personality of your brand if your experience leans more towards the affinity rather than utility. We talk about the concept of using voice actors. We talk about how some kind of voice experiences today are really basic because they're not taking advantage of the one thing that this whole medium should be taking advantage of, which is AI. You know, using the data that you have in all of the systems that you have and all of the data you have on your users, and how can you personalize that experience and use AI to turn that skill into something that is unique and personal for the person using it, rather than it being just a static piece of content where everyone gets the same thing. This conversation is one of these conversations, which is one of the best conversations we've had on the podcast. We've had a few of them. I think Matt Hartman was a really interesting one. Joel Beckerman is another one. Ben Sauer is another one. People always come to me and, you know, they use those as examples of fantastic, enlightening conversations, and this is another one of those. I'm obviously joined by Dustin Coates, as I am each week. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, this is Nick Carey of Potato on VUX World.
VUX World. VUX World. VUX World. VUX World. Branding with the big faces. I love listening to it.
Kane Sims.
Kane Sims, the one and only.
Britain's finest, Mr. Kane Sims.
Dustin Coates.
I like it when you guys are together and talking about voice.
Without further ado,
Welcome to the show.
Okay, Nick Carey, welcome to VUX World, my friend.
Hey, how you doing, guys?
Very well, very well. Yeah, what about you, Dustin?
Yeah, doing okay. How about yourself, Kane?
Very well, very well. Dialing in all the way from San Francisco, Nick.
Yeah, based here in San Francisco.
Wicked. And right next door to where you used to be based, Dustin.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of great startups there, and a lot of great agencies and tech all around.
Wicked. LinkedIn over the road, did you say?
Yeah, so we're across the road from LinkedIn. We've got Slack on like one of the other corners of our street, so surrounded by some of the big tech companies.
Wow, nice. Sounds good. So, Nick, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and about kind of what you're up to and a little bit about Potato as well?
Yeah, sounds good. So I lead the design team here at Potato, based in San Francisco, London and Bristol. I'm a designer who's come from a bit of a varied background. My kind of background initially was from a business degree, so working on that side, and then started to apply it to design through a startup that I founded. I spent 5 years in startups and kind of worked in a few different verticals, so from advertising and media through to a legal startup, looking at how you can use AI to disrupt the legal industry, which was a fun challenge. Got the usual startup grind caught up with me after 5 years, and I really wanted to look at how I could apply what I've learned at a range of different companies. And so I came across Potato, who is kind of a product development studio, as a great opportunity to go and work for a range of different clients on a range of different problems and learn a whole bunch of new things and be able to use lots of new technologies. And so Potato really gave me that opportunity and that platform to look at how we can use different things. And obviously that's how I got to Voice as well. So Potato's kind of MO is launching purposeful and effective products. So we talk a lot about building for humans, so thinking about how things become human-centered. We talk a lot about how you can make new technology work in tangible ways that actually add value, so not just being used for gimmicks. So Voice is really appealing to us because of all of the great things about Voice in terms of its usability and its practicality. But it was also really interesting when we started to work with some clients on some different opportunities, which we launched with Amazon. So one of the first ones that we did was with Jamie Oliver back in 2016. And that was when Alexa was launching in the UK. And then since then, we've actually worked on quite a few gaming concepts with a range of different clients.
Cool. You mentioned the word studio there. I'm seeing that kind of thrown around here and there and everywhere. Is that essentially because you focused on the design and build of the product or the experience, and you're not really bothered about who it is that you're working with? Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the reason for using the word studio is we don't like to call our space an office. The main reason being that we like people to feel really comfortable, and there's lots of sofas and things like that. And I guess it comes from like a bit of a kind of cultural thing from the agency land. But yeah, mainly that's the reason, as opposed to necessarily who we work with.
Okay, because there's agencies, I suppose, that seem a little bit kind of traditional now, don't they? But then, the terminology I'm hearing these days is all about studios and labs.
Yeah, I think there's the agency model itself is kind of going under a big transformation, and Potato's quite different to a lot of agencies. One of our biggest differences is we come from an engineering base. So most agencies out there are typically creative first, and we come from a very strong technical foundation. So our founder was an engineer, and from there we've built. So when I joined, there was no design team, and we've gone along the years and built up a design team at Potato. So one of our kind of USPs there being that we can build design into an engineering foundation, and that's how you can build great products, having good engineers and good designers sitting side by side along with great product strategists.
And so I have to ask, why Potato?
Great question. That's the question that everyone always asks, and it's really bad because there's no clear answer to it. So our founder's never really given the real reason. I mean, as Kane probably knows, sitting in England, the most likely story is they were sat in a pub and had some chips in front of them, as we call them in the UK. And who doesn't want chips? And this is one of the things this is my flavor of the story, which is everybody likes potatoes. You don't meet somebody who says they don't like potatoes. And so this is the kind of more professional spiel, which is that potatoes are really versatile. You can use them however you want. And so being an agency and working across different verticals and things like that, you can kind of expect us to be able to adapt and work within any kind of challenge.
Cool. And so chips, when we say chips, we're talking about fries, aren't we?
Yeah.
Dustin, do they have... Because I was thinking about this the other day when we ordered a bowl of hand-cut, kind of home-cooked chips, which are like really thick, fat, like massive chips. Do you still call them fries in America, or do they not exist?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to me, the word chips is really weird, if I'm being completely honest, the way you guys use it. To me, a chip, it really signifies the onomatopoeia, the crisping of the as you break it apart and you crunch on it. Whereas fries, right? They can be soft, they can be waffle variety, they can be wedges. I think this actually goes back to exactly what you were talking about. Potatoes can just be, a huge type of any kind of food you want to put it into. So we could go on for probably the next hour, but I think people probably want to hear us talk about voice rather than potato products.
Classic, yeah. Okay then. So let's do that then, shall we? Let's get into some voice chat. So, Nick, you mentioned there that you worked on the early kind of Jamie Oliver skill, and that now you were doing a lot in the kind of gaming space and using voice as an accompaniment with kind of games. And we spoke to Gordon Midwood not last week but the week before, I think it might have been, and they're doing something interesting with Anything World, where you can kind of speak it with their platform, allows you to kind of speak to it, and it will kind of bring into the gaming experience something that you've asked for. So in their kind of prototype, you ask for a koala and it'll put a koala into the platform, sort of thing. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the kind of use cases that you've been tackling and some of the kind of projects? I know we're not in the realms of naming names at this point, but just broadly speaking, for those listening, some examples of the kind of stuff that you've been working on in the gaming kind of environment.
Yeah, so the reason why we've been working a lot with gaming is one of the things that voice can bring is a whole new interaction pattern. So typically we thought about gaming from very much a controller first perspective. And that means kind of using your hands, pressing buttons, and that's how your mode of interaction typically for like the last 15, 20 years with games, longer, if you go all the way back to Atari. And one of the things that people love about games is storytelling. The best games out there, the best selling games are all based around great stories, especially when you go into kind of big action games. And the way in which you interact with a story is very passive when it's through a controller. And so what voice can bring to that table is a new way for you to interact with characters within a game. And being able to use that to both interact with characters within the game, but also thinking about faster path to action within a game, that comes back to one of the big USPs of voice, right? If I want to kind of equip a weapon or be able to use some magic potion that would normally take 5 menu presses and kind of a whole range of screens to get to using a controller, all of a sudden that immersive experience becomes much greater. So one of my stories, and I mentioned this one to Kane recently, is because we love the science fiction, or kind of like being able to pull out the references to kind of like other cult references when we talk about voice. And one of the ones which I'm always surprised most people don't mention is one of the recent Spider-Man films, where he puts on the spider suit for the first time and he realizes he can use his voice to change some of the ways in which he uses the suit. And that really brings to life some of like the ways in which gaming can use voice. And then aside from that, and kind of on a more personal level, one of the things that's amazing about voice for games is games are a little bit of a sandbox for where we want voice to go. So this is really what excites me is in the future, if we think back to kind of like, I'm going to use another cult reference, we always talk about like her, the input method of a voice assistant knowing lots about you is very manual right now. You know, you kind of have to tell a voice assistant manually, add things to your calendar, input things into an app in order for it to learn. And most of them don't really have that much training involved in actually learning about you. But because of the way in which a video game is structured, with a clear path and an API, which you can use that data to program and understand a user's behavior, then you could actually build these recommendation engines that take into account what you've done and where you've been. And so it's just like a sandbox of where we want voice assistants to go. And it's quite a fun space to play with it.
So it sounds as though from what you were talking about there, and we haven't necessarily covered this in great detail, and maybe this is an indicator that we probably need to, is that you were talking very much about the AI and the recommendations and the learning behavior and the kind of like personalization part of the assistant, which isn't necessarily anything to do with the voice input and voice output bit. Talking about that as if it's the same thing. Is that kind of your understanding of it, or would you see that the AI and all that behind the scenes stuff is something separate, or is that part of the voice assistant?
That's a really good question. I mean, they're separate, right? One thing is kind of the voice as an input method. I guess this is where kind of voice today versus voice where we want the voice to get to. Voice is obviously a really good input method, but my question when I play with some voice experiences is, what am I getting back from it? So what's kind of the effort to reward, or is it kind of a static experience which I'm going to kind of, the third party's built and I'm going to get bored of pretty quickly kind of thing? Is it providing me back any value as a user? And one of the really interesting areas for voice is how, I mean, one of the benefits of voice is a short command hopefully can do so much for you. And in order for that to happen, it perhaps for some kind of like, for some things that aren't hardware based, you know, like turning on a light, for things that are more software in their nature, I think we need to see kind of some AI based work for it to kind of do some interesting things for me. So whether there's informational services such as what the weather is or kind of what's on my calendar today. But if I want to kind of get some further value beyond informational services, then there's an interesting element to it of what might be more AI based.
Because most of the AI side of things right now is all in the kind of natural language understanding, isn't it? And not actually what you end up having to or wanting to do. Is that where gaming bridges that gap, in that there is more kind of AI capability that you have at your disposal? If you're building a game anyway, you might use that AI, so you've already got that at your disposal. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the output is. So like if my input is something and there's a lot of data related back to the input I'm giving my voice assistant, then there's an opportunity there to do something interesting back with it.
What would an example of that be?
So an example of that being, let's say I was looking for a recommendation on what I should do next within a game. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of game level data. There's a lot of like user level data. And so there's an opportunity there for kind of thinking about, okay, with the user level data that we have, e.g. your ability to perform in this type of activity versus this type of activity. So that might be, let's say, if it's a game that's based on kind of, if it's a game that's based on shooting and kind of PvP versus PvE, so player versus player versus player versus environment, and you're more suited towards player versus player activities than player versus environment activities. And on the other hand, there's kind of like game level data and there's a new tournament coming up. You can then kind of build a recommendation engine around that which would then be able to say to the user, hey, based on these kind of stats, you're most likely to be performing well in this kind of activity. And it can be using that data over time to say, hey, you've been improving your activity in these type of kind of environments. Why don't you try this one next? So from the kind of levels of data which exist within the game, that voice input is great, but the ability for the output to be manipulated in such a way that it's dynamic based on data is what I think is a really interesting space, because when I talk to a human, I get most of my value back from what the other human says back to me, right? And I think that's where I relate back the voice input, as you mentioned, back to kind of what the output is in return. If I'm looking for it to perform an action for me, such as turning on the TV or switching on my lights, then it's very transactional. I'm expecting it to do something for me. It's kind of very subservient in its methods as an assistant. If I'm asking for information, again, I kind of just want the information as cleanly and as quickly as possible. But if I'm looking for something on kind of a slightly more emotional connection level, or something where I'm looking for that kind of level of understanding of me, then yeah, I think that's when data and AI does start to come to play a part. And those are the hardest parts of the experiences to build right now, because as a human, expecting the assistant to know that much about me, it needs to source that data from somewhere. And hence my kind of like line of thinking here in terms of like gaming being so interesting for that, because there is that level of data of you as a gamer within games. And so there's that opportunity to think a bit further about what that assistant is returning back to you.
And if you're a game company or a game studio and you have multiple games that you might release on voice, can you take some of that information about the users from one game and apply it to another, or are these really completely separated and each one has to develop that personalization?
Yeah, that's a really good question there, Dustin. And last year I was at GDC with Amazon on Amazon's booth. And I was talking to some different games companies about this. And one of the things and there was a lot of interest last year at GDC. So Amazon had a great Alexa booth at GDC last year. And on the Alexa booth, lots of games companies were talking and really interested in voice and how voice could be applied. And one of the things about it, and this is, I think, one of the challenges in getting kind of voice into games, is thinking about it early enough, because you have to expose that data over an API. And so how you're thinking about your API in your game and being able to make that work is really important. And then building that player persona. So a studio or a publisher could create that data and then perhaps have that data live as a profile between games. There are some publishers that have like profiles that are across multiple games. But the more and more games are changing, and like the revenue models of games are changing very quickly right now, etc. There is that really interesting opportunity to think about kind of data within games and thinking about how they might be used in these new and interesting ways. So it's a real space that's ripe for thinking about kind of voice or different ways of interacting with games.
Mm. And I think that's probably like, it's such an interesting area, that, because quite often, let's say if you're a hobbyist and you're building an Alexa skill, you'll quite often create the entire thing. You might use you might build a weather skill and use like an API or something, but let's say you build a game or you build an interactive story or you build something that's a standalone thing, then you're essentially you're creating that data capture rather than using existing data from elsewhere. And it's kind of like one of the things that people kind of talk about often is that we're waiting for that kind of killer kind of app or whatever that's going to come and revolutionize and make voice kind of shoot into the stars or whatever. But it sounds as though the kind of this using this data and understanding people's preferences and kind of being able to kind of like tailor what the assistant does based on previous behavior. I don't know what your thoughts are, Dustin, in terms of, is there not enough data in terms of when people are building skills? Is there not enough data to get them started and they're starting from scratch? Is that why some of these things are not quite as sticky?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we struggle with on the search side as well. Really, we talk about games now, but it applies to everything. The more information you have about someone, the more you can aid them in discovery, aid them in building a context eventually for them. And what I'm wondering is there something that Amazon can do, that Google can do, that essentially will pull this information together to exactly like you said, allow those indie developers to build those experiences and bootstrap them a little bit?
Yeah, big time. And I think one of the spaces that I've kind of seen a lot of people excited or heard a lot of interest is kind of medical, right? You know, there's a real lot of people that are kind of really excited about when the right things are going to be in place to be able to have voice work in a kind of sensitive and data sensitive way, so you can start to build some of those kind of experiences. And I mean, Apple have been pushing kind of building that data about you through Watch and etc., like for medical, for quite a while, and being able to use Watch for recommendations and things like that. That's been pretty much one of the main like wearable routes, is building up that data about you and then being able to make recommendations. And I think for voice, that's going to be a really interesting one once kind of all the approvals happen and the technology changes, so that it's not sending all that data through the cloud, but being able to use it locally, but then being able to use that for like health recommendations. Like there are some good ones. There have been I've had some really interesting things about people looking at habit forming and things like that through voice. But that's one where perhaps that data flow is going to be really interesting for developers and perhaps lead to what that future billion-dollar idea is in voice. But I definitely think, to your point there, Kane, the two are almost definitely linked in terms of having to create experience through voice and all using static content that's created now versus creating something that's actually aware of the user is kind of that bridge to build.
And it's interesting because this hasn't come up for a while, but it is stuff that we've kind of touched on in previous shows where we've spoken to Rain Agency, for example, and they were talking very much about voice essentially being, from a utility perspective, being part of your system's ecosystem. And you might have a mobile app, you might have something on the watch, but then you might have a voice assistant and it all uses the same systems integration. So you're getting the knowledge from that side of things. And then I think it was Matt Hartman that was talking before that about how the way that most companies are approaching building out products is that they will build a core suite of technology, or the brain as he called it, and then the interface is almost negligible. Like it doesn't really matter what the interface is because you're using that core kind of brain. So and then it kind of becomes again the intelligence is central, and then the voice is essentially just the thing that accesses it and returns it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look around and look at some of like the patents and things like that, there's like Amazon have got some like things around and how they looking to use like empathy in a user's voice and be able to recognize that as cues and things like that. So there's all these kind of pointers as well towards where we want that technology to go to that will allow us to build those experiences that truly understand the user rather than understanding the input. So I think like that comes back full circle back to one of the points you made earlier, Kane, which is like all of the work right now is kind of like in the understanding of the words said versus actually that next level above, which is like understanding more than that. So whether it's the sound of the user or relating what they've said to kind of what we know.
I think this is kind of like getting into the point that you we've spoke about before, and the kind of angle that you take when creating voice assistants in the gaming world is that concept of building an assistant on an assistant. And I'll let you kind of explain what that means. But essentially, as it stands at the moment, a lot of these third-party skills tend to just be one-off things, one-off pieces of functionality, whereas you're approaching that slightly differently when you're working with voice with games.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because there's kind of this way in which I map a lot of because we often talk to other brands and there's kind of this map, and I'm going to move my hands, but no one's going to be able to see this when they hear it. But there's like two axes. So one of these axes is like utility, which we talk about a lot of the time with voice. It's like how much utility is there, but one of the other axes is affinity. So it's like how much affinity does the user have back with that brand or that skill, that application, whatever it is. So you can build something with a ton of utility, right? You can have, like, the weather has a ton of utility. What's the weather? The amount of affinity you get back with it, if it's kind of low for the weather, you don't really care, it's transactional information, but you always need it. As soon as you start to move away from something that's ultra high utility, you need more and more affinity for your users to want to keep coming back to you. So let's say your brand is, let's give something fun as an example. Nike. A lot of people really love Nike as a brand. Now, Nike can move down the utility spectrum if they've got a really, really high brand affinity. However, for a brand, even a brand like Nike, that affinity is not as much as, say, like a character in a game or something like that, or a TV series that people kind of want to come back and like binge on. And so that's where you can really start to skew like utility versus affinity. And so it's a really interesting dynamic between the two. And the way in which you kind of get closest or in the best place between them is kind of having a strong emotional connection back. And so if you can build a skill that increases the affinity, so it gets to know you, or can give you recommendations, then you can actually use voice to increase the affinity between you and the brand. It's kind of like the way in which we talk about this. And so that's why we start to talk about an assistant on assistant, because it starts to think of a bit more, when we talk about the word assistant or the reason why we use the word assistant, it's thinking a little bit more about what's the value you get back from talking to like a physical speaker or your phone. And so we want that to be an increasingly less transactional experience if the utility isn't exactly like something that I have a habit forming experience of needing every day, such as the weather.
This sounds a bit like our conversation, Kane, with the BBC Kids, where they had that affinity the kids have for this specific presenter, and they're going there to really speak with that presenter, with that character. Nicholas,
yeah, that's a great episode, by the way, guys. Yeah, I really enjoyed that BBC Kids one because it was really interesting. Kind of it's a lot of parallels, right? The kids space, like the game space, it was really interesting hearing those parallels and kind of like that random sorting of like where the BBC were just shuffling and using a random kind of thing if the voice input wasn't recognized. But the fact that, hey, you didn't need to have that high utility, because if the kids got the kind of completely random new character to speak to, that was just as fun. And so the affinity was so high that the utility didn't need to be perfect. And it's a really great example of that kind of graph and curve in place.
What other brands would you say are doing a good job of building affinity into voice experiences?
That's a great question. So it's I'll give you an example of one where I think actually that kind of affinity and utility was really well combined, which is one that gets spoken about quite a bit, but it's Tide. I don't know if you come across the Tide skill, but the Tide skill's used for stain removal. And so they did a really good job of kind of taking something that if you were like, would you use a Tide skill? You'd probably go, why would I add a skill for Tide to my Alexa? Why would I want to talk to Tide? But what they did is they really thought about that utility point really well. So you ask the skill for like a red wine stain on the carpet, and you kind of you say you've got that stain, and Tide will tell you how to remove it. And what they did is they really thought about that assistant on assistant model in kind of the most true way possible. how could Tide be useful to me from an affinity point of view? How could I build that connection back with Tide in a way in which it helps me? And they did it in a way in which they didn't need to know necessarily the data actually, but they found a way in which their product really fits that kind of value proposition in terms of where the user will need it and how the user can create its voice back to talk to you in that scenario. And so you can ask it for a different type of stain, and Tide will tell you how to remove the stain using their products. And so what that ends up doing is saying, hey, when I need help, when I need help with the stain, I'm going to ask Tide. And so they've kind of changed their brand language there around it to fit the voice. And so rather than coming up with, hey, let's do like a campaign or anything that's marketing driven, they've just really truly kind of looked at the user journey, the customer experience, and found where voice would best fit their product.
So this just to confirm this, is what you're saying that the less utility you provide, the more affinity you need to build?
Yeah.
Okay. So for something that is just, where's my parcel, what's the weather, that kind of stuff, it's not as important. But when you start getting down into the more kind of things where engagement is more important and utility is less so, that's where you need essentially to have more of a relationship, I suppose. Is that the right way of saying it? Yeah,
exactly. And one of the things that we've been doing a lot is like using not just Alexa's voice for that, right? So kind of recording new audio as well. So one of the things that we did on one of the skills that we built was using kind of an actor, quite famous one, and recording a ton of custom audio, and then using kind of some of the techniques from video games. Another great one. I always laugh because like I remember some of the great lines from FIFA 98, where it was like, you make a tackle and it says that tackle hurt my whole family. And there's some really good lines in that game. And it's like that kind of like dynamic audio that you get back from like video games where you make an action and you get some funny response. And that's kind of the affinity side, right? It's like if you can build in that custom audio and think about it creatively. So great copywriting being something that's really important in the process, you can really start to build up that affinity.
And I have seen an example of that being attempted, but so for example, in that FIFA example, you might have like, I don't know, 20, 30, 100 responses that you'll put randomly in different places. And I've seen one example of a skill which I won't mention, but they tried to use that, but they only had like 2 or 3 variations. So you get to the end of a particular point and you'll get one random variation, but then once you've been in there for a while, you get the same variations over and over and over. It's kind of like, there wasn't quite as much of it kind of there.
Yeah, so we use dynamic stitching. So one of the skills that we did, we put, maybe this is a little more technical, so Dustin will enjoy this, is we put thousands of different samples into an S3 bucket. And then based on the type of response and the kind of input from the user, as well as some of the input from the game, we then choose to dynamically stitch together all of these different variations from S3 on the fly and return them back as one single MP3. And so we took several thousand lines and created 100 million possible responses from it, which is really fun. That was like one of the funnest challenges I worked on in the voice space. It was just like creating these really complex maps of different responses and then stitching them together to make tons of variations. So we can take, for example, a percentage level, and then based on whether the percentage level is in a certain percentile, create a different percentile type response that adds some kind of flavor of like success or, hey, you should definitely be doing better. But then like with tons of different personality within them. So we then have like different buckets of these different types of percentile responses. So there's this really fun ways of creating this like huge amount of affinity by creating these like dynamic stitched on the fly MP3s.
Wow.
How did you do that so that it sounds more natural, so you don't have the classic, you have 80% remaining?
Yeah, so luckily working with video game companies, they actually have tons of experience with that in the audio recording process. So we used a professional studio for that. And One of the things that I didn't know as well is just like the quality of the act is so important there in the voice recording. It sounds really natural, but also kind of like putting punctuation in the right places makes such a difference. So recording the kind of stems in the right way. So kind of recording, you have 80% rather than you have an 80% as separate stems. It's a little bit more work in the recording, but the results made it easier for us to kind of create the stems. So like you have 80% and then being like going into a new line and then starting that new line with, dude, that was absolutely terrible. Like as a kind of separate line. That just makes the stitching so much easier because you've got this part of the stem and this part of the stem, and you're relating kind of 80% to you're absolutely killing it, man. As kind of two separate stems, so they all can work much better on the fly in terms of changing.
And I imagine the bucketing that you mentioned helps with that a lot as well, so that you're not saying 1%, 2%, 3%, but you have like say 10 buckets, then you just have to record 10.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we ended up recording 4,000 or 5,000 lines, but yeah, we used like, although we recorded that many lines, we actually had quite a big number of buckets that enabled us to create that many millions of variations, because actually that's where like having 100 lines of 1%, 2%, 3%, that's not where we want the most amount of variance. We want the most amount of variance in the fun lines, like you're killing it and that stuff. So
that's a good example of where what you mentioned at the top of the show was that, you know, the team that you work with in the company comes from an engineering background. So that's probably where I'm assuming that those kind of skills come in handy when you just say, look, we want just loads of random variation in the responses to make it really engaging and to increase the affinity. And if you've got the technical kind of bedrock to make that happen.
Yeah, exactly. That was definitely one of the things that was really useful. And then being able to kind of look at that and pushing, kind of talking to Amazon, who are really great partners to work with on some of the skills that we've worked on in terms of like the amount of like stitching or the amount of like audio files you can return and things like that. So 100% something that our engineers are really great when coming to them with these kind of ideas and pushing the boundaries.
What's your kind of approach to creating this kind of stuff then? You know, I know I've seen a post you wrote on was it Advertising Week, I think it was, from last June, and you kind of touched on some of the kind of process in terms of the process that you would go through in creating this. I'm wondering whether we can kind of touch on, you know, how you approach creating an assistant on an assistant, and then how do also the design and development and strategy kind of components all work together?
Yeah, so I actually always take everything like right back out of voice, always at the start of any kind of process, and start doing things like empathy maps. So obviously this is UX, like VUX, so kind of coming back to user experience here, and kind of like empathy maps and understanding personas, and really kind of talking them through the user side of it first. One of the things, even like talking about games and some of the games that we've worked on, there's so much variation in the type of people that play games and the reason they play games. And so if you're talking about building like an assistant or an assistant or anything that kind of needs to talk to people on like a human level, taking that human-centered approach is like number one. And I think that's one of the things that too quickly when we play with new technologies or new things that are things that designers or engineers like to kind of have fun with, we sometimes forget some of that fundamentals of product design and product development, which is so important to come back to. So it's really about kind of understanding like your users, and if you're building for a brand, or coming back to like talking in Advertising Week, so why brands should build for voice. Again, it's kind of not starting with any creative concept thing or anything like that, but like going back to that Tide example that I used earlier in the show, it's about like, why do people want to use this? Like, where does it fit into their user journey? Where does it fit into the customer experience? And like, what's the right point at which you're going to engage them? And then meeting the user where they are, right? It's like, don't force them to say, hey, brand Y or brand Z or app Z, like, do this for me. And it's not part of their natural language. It's not part of the way in which their modes of thinking are, especially with voice where it's so tied to like their own words and their own ways of talking. So first part of the answer there is definitely about really thinking through the user experience and the customer experience. Have you got any? Did that answer everything there, Kane? Or
yeah, I think so. Yeah. And in terms of before you kind of approaching it not like a voice specific thing, but approaching it from a typical kind of design, product design, user experience design kind of perspective.
Yeah, and I think looking at like not just voice, but like AR and VR, which are like other emerging technologies, it's kind of like really kind of obvious when you see kind of the amount of waste in kind of work in all of these spaces where there's kind of so many things that people don't use or don't enjoy or don't really connect with kind of people that aren't hugely in tune with the space. That's one of the things that is always really interesting is kind of how do I make this work for my sister who uses her kind of Google Home because I bought it for her and uses it to turn on Netflix and her TV kind of thing. What's the reason why? Kind of somebody who's not working in tech right now is going to care about what you're working on?
It's the kind of 80-20 rule, isn't it? Like where 20% of your features are used by 80% of your users, or so it's kind of like, I suppose, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's why you start out from that human-centric perspective. Is what you're aiming for really is you want to try and find what that 20% is.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a big reason why, like, I'm going to bring it back to like Potato for a minute. What we kind of hold very dearly, these four ideologies that we talk about a lot, which is kind of like making new technology count in terms of like the positive and like transformational effects of technology, or how we make digital work for kind of real people's lives to positively like complement interactions that they have in the real world. And so that kind of thinking is kind of, I think, really important, quite often lost when we just get left to our own creative direction, which is like, how can I make something cool that I would use because I use an Alexa device every day and this will be fun.
And then how do you take that on then from defining the user and the persona and stuff like that, and how does it kind of transform from that into an actual project or into a product?
Yeah, so one of the key things, again, a little bit to this, is just staying as low fidelity as possible. So being able to kind of not go into any of the tech side first, but actually modeling through real world conversation, and kind of using that research first, so staying really lean to prove if the concept is viable or not. And that's also kind of how we build up that kind of empathy map, or that user persona stuff, is like really actually talking to people, like who we want to use this or who we think would use this. So being in tune with them and saying, if you could talk to, I'm going to say, like, as an example for like a video game, if we were using an example of a video game, or let's say the video game's character was Harry Potter, if you were to talk to somebody who reads Harry Potter books and say, if you were to talk to Harry Potter, what would you ask them? Like, that's starting to get into someone's imagination and brain, and kind of like, as someone with affinity back to a character, where they would see that kind of development go. And so even if that's kind of like a fictional character who someone would really like to be able to talk to from a storytelling video game perspective, or let's say if that was replaced with a brand, and that brand was like, let's say, going back to my example earlier, Nike, what would you want Nike to be able to do for you? Then, and kind of really starting to ask the users, because that's where you're going to kind of start to see some really interesting ideas come around.
And do you kind of, from that point, is it from a design and development perspective, is it kind of like the designers and developers are working closely together throughout this kind of period, and then is it kind of the same kind of approach into the kind of the build in terms of iteratively building it out and usability testing or whatnot at every point?
Yeah, we take so we're very much like an agile studio. So we do everything in 2 week sprints, and we take a very outcomes focused approach. So trying to measure every sprint with like an outcome and seeing whether there's a hypothesis to be validated. So we take a very hypothesis driven approach all the time. So like we might have a hypothesis from like empathy maps and research that users want to kind of ask you or talk to a fictional character or a brand about X or Y. And so we'll then work as designers and engineers as closely and collaboratively as we can together to be able to test and build something as quickly and as lean as we can to see if that is a hypothesis that we should kind of move into production or scale up and think around. So we'll try and put together the right pieces to do that, and think about what the right kind of quality and fidelity is for that.
Yeah, I think the last question that I would have for you is, you weren't doing voice forever. It sounds like maybe you came into it when you joined Potato. How is it different than what you thought it was going to be coming in?
Really different. I think one of the things that's been really interesting is it's really interesting. I'm really curious if this is the same for other people, but how it's kind of really engaged in my brain in different ways. And so it's piqued a lot of curiosity that I perhaps didn't have before, like curiosities in linguistics, curiosities in kind of like how people talk and the words that they choose to use for different scenarios. And it kind of had me reading into kind of things that go back 100 years in linguistics that I kind of haven't really kind of found that I did so much with like visual design for like graphical user interfaces. And so one of the things that just piqued my curiosity, and one of the things that I think is so interesting about voice, is how it starts to question so much more about our own identity and our own ways of talking and thinking, and our ways of being that's so different to how we design and build for graphical user interfaces.
And kind of different, it affects how you kind of form relationships, doesn't it? I mean, most of this conversation has been about creating affinity, which is, you know, creating an emotional connection and a relationship with that assistant, which is fundamental to what humans are, isn't it? Making connections, building relationships.
Yeah, exactly. It had me looking at some completely random books along the way about like how you get people to like you. Like, not something that I choose to read myself, but it's like a really interesting book in terms of if you're building this third-party character, what are the attributes of a third-party character from things like personality versus character versus attitude, like all these different components that are studied from kind of a very psychology-driven route in terms of like, because there's no screen as well, so you're one step removed from like, it's just the word sometimes, how people listen to those words and what kind of reaction that triggers in people. It's such an interesting thing, and I think that's where sometimes there's this kind of little bit of trepidation in going into voice from like a big brand perspective. It's like thinking in terms of like, well, how am I going to talk to kind of customers in the right way, which creates our brand identity in a new kind of audio-driven route. And it's really interesting. It kind of goes into radio, like some really interesting areas I haven't studied much, like radio as well, like creating radio ads, and what the right voice is for those. So many interesting roads that just branch out from so many different avenues that I hadn't explored before. So really fun.
Fantastic. Well, Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. If people want to kind of keep up with your exploration and kind of figure out what's going on with you, or reach out to you and Potato, what's the best way for them to follow you or reach out?
Yeah, so I'm not the most active person on Twitter, but my Twitter handle is NSD Carey, Carey. But you can also visit Potato's website at p.ota.to. It spells out potato. It's one of those custom vanity domains. You probably need to find a link because sometimes it's hard to follow.
I did just check it before the podcast, and I did get it wrong. So first of all, I did po.ta.to, And if you visit that, you can try it, Nick, if you like. Visit that, and you'll find, not surprisingly, a picture of a potato.
Right.
and also, I visited pota.to, and there's another picture of a potato. So I don't know whether Potato have bought those domains and kind of just stuck pictures of potatoes there, but
Amazing.
yeah,
There is some amazing potato stuff on the internet that I only found out once I was working for Potato.
really. Classic.
But the ability to send people a potato, that's actually a thing.
Wicked. Well, Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us from San Francisco. I've absolutely loved this conversation. It's been absolutely immense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick.
Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed it too.
That was Nick Carey of Potato. Wow. That was, I had to come up for air after that one. That was absolutely mesmerising. Really, really, really interesting to hear. I mean, that podcast started out supposing to be a podcast talking about how voice and games can kind of interlink and intertwine with each other, advancing on the stuff that we spoke about with Gordon Midwood over the last few weeks. But it turned into more of a, I suppose, a strategic appraisal at how to go about positioning and creating and strategically implementing voice assistants in general. And I think there was a couple of main really, really salient points that Nick was making. One is that although voice is the interface, it's actually the AI and the functionality behind the scenes that makes the assistant what it can and should be. And I think that's where maybe us in the industry that are kind of got our heads down and are kind of cracking on with stuff, maybe we kind of overlook that sometimes, in that it's not just about voice as an input or voice as an output. It's actually about, and it's not just about building, question and answer skills and joke skills. It's about kind of creating an experience. And with the technologies that exist today, we can create more personalized experiences. Interesting in terms of where the parallels are from gaming to outside of that in other industries. In terms of in gaming, you already have a whole ton of data. You've already got gaming data, and you've also got player data. So maybe something to think about when you're going through the process of scoping out what a voice experience might look like, is to look at what kind of data do you have access to that you can pull into the experience. Because I think that's where really the key is to creating something that's engaging. And on creating something that's engaging, I really, really liked Nick's example of the utility versus affinity map, and how if something is high utility, then you don't really need any affinity. You don't really need to have a relationship with that thing, because it just serves its purpose. When's my package gonna be here? What's the weather tomorrow? But as soon as you start having something that does require engagement, and this is what a lot of the branded experiences are designed to do, like the Tide skill example that Nick gave, when you want to create that relationship and you want to build engagement and you want to have something that's used time and time again, and it has something that is successful over time, you need to build affinity. And that's where Nick's example of building an assistant on an assistant, essentially a character that you can relate to. And this is probably an example of where if brands already have characters or mascots or the voice of the brand, or if that already exists, then you're in a really, really good position, because you don't have to establish that. You can just transfer that across into the voice environment. But for those brands who don't have that audio brand, or who don't have that affinity with their users, then that's where the work needs to be done. Fantastic episode. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us. Thank you, Dustin, as always. And boys and girls, thank you all for listening. Until next time, see you later.